Everyone. My name's Simon Goodrich. I'm one of the co-founders of Portable, which is a public innovation company. Maybe I'll talk a bit more about what we mean by that later today, but I appreciate everyone joining here today for our talk on capitalism, culture and responsibility. What next for Australian business? Firstly, I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and New Zealand and their connections to land, sea and community. I am currently on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Melinda is joining us from Wurundjeri country in the Kulin Nation, and Andrew is Tamaki Makoto, Auckland, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, across the ditch as part of this talk. For Andrew's over there for B Corp this week. I'm actually at an impact investment conference here in Sydney. But, on behalf of all of us, I want to pay respects to Indigenous elders past and present. We acknowledge we get living and working in the land that has been cared for tens of thousands of years by Indigenous people. And if I think through and I reflect on the word of capitalism and sort of the role of what businesses play, reflecting with First Australians communities, which we interact with at Portable, especially through our work now at Pledger, that role of self-determination and through that economic independence. And what role that can play and businesses can play as the next generations of First Nations folks are coming through. So I want to thank everyone for coming along to this event. This was really just an idea that came out from one of the regular lunches that I have with Andrew. Andrew is the CEO of BLAB, Australia and New Zealand, and I was really interested in his take on what was happening around us in the world of business. This would, I think, we met, I believe, and it was moving last in middle February. This was post the Trump inauguration, and also just to get a sense of what was happening around the world. I just got off a podcast from Mark Andreessen. He's one of the founders at Andreessen Horowitz, probably one of the largest investors in technology of the last 30 years. And all that was bad about America and what was bad that was happening under Biden and his views of what the future held under Trump. I'm also hearing Mark Zuckerberg go on similar podcasts and shifting his policy of how meta senses, and beyond that, his love of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and how to get more masculinity in the workplace. And then you had Elon Musk doing what he was doing. I mean, these people were coming from what I thought was my world, this technology world, which is seeking to drive change, which they are. But it was this very distinct shift that was happening in Silicon Valley and very soon to Wall Street that was sort of shifting in that part too, in the views of what it meant around ESG, what it meant within DEI and other parts. So I said to Andrew, I want to talk about this publicly. Is there a thing where are we just in this little cabal that businesses, we're this sort of esoteric bit of business, or what role does it play beyond just being able to get a return to shareholders and part of that play too? So, and after I just met up with Andrew, I saw Melinda Cilento present on CEDA's new strategy, Progress 2050, which I was enthused about for a bolder Australia. So this was Melinda in the CEDA team, which is the Committee for Economic Development Australia, launched that, I think, at the start of this month, and to sort of put a blueprint of what that could look like for Australia. And we've been members of CEDA for a number of years and I've always been really impressed by Melinda's leadership and the types of conversations she leads on, how to have a better, more productive Australia. And also saying the way that she's shaping her organisation, which is a leading public policy think tank, with a mission to achieve sustainable long-term prosperity for all Australians. And I think this shift that we're seeing, it's early in a piece, like what's happening in this new world order, but I think there's a collective sense that things are changing and we're entering this new area that differs a lot from the last 40, 45 years politically, culturally and economically. And when change happens, there's also that opportunity to shape a fearful future or a visionary one. And anyone who knows anything about what I've written knows that I'm an optimist on these things. And I wanted to see how we can bring together people like we have today to give people a bit of what could be seen as hope to that future. So how can we shape capitalism, culture and responsibility? This year marks 20 years of me being at Portable, company I founded, but it's edging each year towards half my life. Birthday's coming up in a few weeks. But we are a public innovation company, and that means that it's more than just design and technology agency, but a place where we seek to enable change for a better world. We're not an NGO, nor are we government, but we're a company, and specifically a B Corp, and working with the sectors within government and NGO to drive that change. So I don't think what's happening around me changes this vision. It might actually enable it more. But with the chat over lunch with Andrew and what I, a few weeks back, and we wanted to talk to this more publicly and also get the perspective of how Melinda's background is also as an economist. She was also senior leadership role within the Productivity Commission, very interested in the role that we grow better as Australians, sees it, and through that, you folks too. So what we are wanting you to walk away with from today is some inspiration of what we can do and how we might be able to harness business in this drive towards cultural change. So on that note, I'm delighted to have both Andrew and Melinda in the room with me today. I mentioned Andrew is the CEO of B Lab Australia and New Zealand. It's a non-profit global network behind the B Corporation certification. We at Portable have been members for coming on 10 years. I speak to Andrew often. I've been like, can we do more? Can we be able to enact some of that change? And Andrew comes from a background of family offices, of being involved across a range of different sort of businesses that are well outside the realms of what traditionally would be B Corp, both from listed companies to startups. So really fascinated to get his perspectives. And as mentioned, Melinda is CEO at CEDA, and she's also Deputy Chair of Australian Unity and Co-Chair of Reconciliation Australia. So bringing together a lot of the different parts of what we make up a society and really thinking about where we want to sit within capitalism, culture and responsibility. And before I pass over to start the discussions with Andrew and Melinda, I just want to sort of run through how we're planning to run this session. We've got a Menti survey. We did one of them recently, and it's part with just a couple of questions. So I'm just going to ask Rachel, who's supporting us, to sort of provide a bit of a link there in it. Just open that up if you can. We'll sort of come back to that as a part. There's a few questions that Melinda, Andrew, and I were interested in getting your perspectives on, of seeing do that work too. And then what we'll do is we'll open up to, I've got a series of questions and stuff that I've spoken about both with Andrew and Melinda that we want to talk about more publicly, probably ask questions ourselves, and then open up as we get to probably 20 to questions for yourselves, which we'll take within, which we'll also take within the Zoom chat, which will be part of that soon. So that's sort of how we have the proceedings. Like with all the things that we do at Portable, we'll set this up as a recording. For those that are not able to come, if they're in person, we'll be able to share that. So that will come as part of it too. But so to start, and I might start with you, Andrew, because we were starting on that part, like you and I were having this lunch, would have been like, what is going on and what does that change? And I'm just sort of interested from your perspective of the origin story of what your thoughts are of where we're looking at this point we're at with business, culture, responsibility, and some of your initial reflections or your thinking of what's brought you to this state, and what are some of the things that are burning on your mind that you'd like to do. So over to you for some introductory comments.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and really appreciate you setting this up. And hope we do get some curious and challenging questions that come out of this conversation, because I think that's the simple answer is, I don't know what the heck's going on at the moment, but I'm super fascinated about what comes next. And I came across, after we last caught up, I came across a quote from a Slovenian philosopher, Slavoj Žižek. Current time, we find that easier to imagine the end of the world than we do the end of capitalism. And that sort of stuck with me, because even though B Lab's job is to change the economic system, and we have a vision of one that's inclusive, equitable and regenerative, and that's core of our mission, there are plenty of days where I do imagine the world ending before I imagine capitalism ending. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because the reality is the world is changing around us, and so is capitalism. People are having radically different conversations inside business than they were 20 years ago. It's just that we're not yet seeing the results of that. And so it's very easy to fall into that deeply pessimistic mindset that no change is happening. But first of all, I think it is happening, and I think it's really encouraging. And the kind of change that's necessary that we talk about a bit is that there's two sort of dominant things that really dictate how any business behaves. There's the culture of business and the structures around us, most obviously manifesting in laws and regulations that drive business. But the two work really closely together, and both of them are largely creatures of the post-World War II era, particularly the culture of business is the creature of kind of the Friedman doctrines, 1970s, 80s and 90s way of doing business. We're dealing with these kind of ways of these norms that are completely wildly unsuited to the times that we're in. When most businesses are grappling with problems that are problems of the commons. When I was young, starting off in business, I was in that era of, customers always right, come up with the best product. Your job is to compete and win and beat the competitor. And you largely work within the four walls of your business and you follow the latest management theory and off you went. Whereas now when you think about the conversations I've even just had this week with businesses, the problems that they're grappling with are far bigger than them. And an enlightened few are trying to solve those problems from within their business. And that's deeply inspiring, but ultimately, of course, it will be insufficient. So I think the really fascinating thing is, how do you harness the power of business, accept that our culture and structure of business needs to change because the businesses, the problems that we're grappling with in a deeply interconnected world are largely ones that no individual business can solve, but they all need to solve them. So I'll come back later. I know you want to dig into kind of what's the business case for change at an individual business level, which I think is really important too. But that's how I'd frame it. I'm choosing optimism. I think that we are seeing change around us, but I also think that we are definitely in a challenging moment where it does feel like there's some regressive tendencies. I choose to see them as the sort of reaction of people losing power who are always going to do so reluctantly. I think the fundamentals of change sitting beneath that remain really strong. And we'll hopefully get into that a bit more later.
Thanks, Andrew. Melinda, I'm interested in hearing from your perspectives. Like, there's obviously the strategy 2050 that you're doing with CEDA, but just your own reflections, I guess, of the point we're at now, and whether you're coming to this time as a point of optimism, doubling down, or like being able to roll back some of the things that we've been working on and looking at businesses in Australia and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, look, I am by nature an optimist, so I've got to say that, and then people can take that into account when they hear what I've got to say. I think, I think it is a pretty interesting time that we're at the moment, and that's a euphemism for all sorts of things. But I think when you look back, you can see the seeds for what's going now have been were planted a while ago, and some of the challenges we face now are things that we just didn't lean into enough at the time, and we've seen the complexity of the world around us grow, but the way we've engaged with it and the narratives that we've allowed to be sort of perpetrated and run around it haven't become more nuanced or inclusive or engaging, right? And so I'm an economist. A lot of the work that we're doing now and a lot of what I've done at CEDA has reflected things that I've learned on the way through a really long career in public policy and economics, and some simple narratives that we all sort of accepted, that beneath which there was a lot of different truth, right? And so right from the start at my time at CEDA, I've been here for 7 years, we did a bunch of surveys of the broader community. They're statistically significant surveys of thousands of people to sort of test some of the things that we were sort of bumping up against. And one was that this sort of economic growth equals prosperity narrative. So everyone loves a strong economy, but actually when you went and talked to people, they didn't feel that they'd benefited from what economists were touting as this generation of sustained economic growth. And what that told us was that the strong economy wasn't as strong as we thought. And the benefits that we thought people were appreciating, they weren't appreciating. And that's because actually a lot of the benefits that weren't there, because while headline growth was strong, there was no productivity, there was no innovation, and there was no real wage growth. So people were feeling disconnected from it. So that idea of how do you connect the broader community to the economy? I mean, honestly, the economy is just the people and community. So how do you actually start talking about it that way rather than the other way around? And think about that. The other thing that we did was we surveyed, one of our surveys actually asked people, do you want business to focus just on financial and economic results, or do you want them to focus on environmental results, or do you want them to focus on social results and outcomes? And ta-da, they said all three, please, in equal measure, right? So And this was at a time when everyone was saying, oh, we really want business to stick to its knitting. That whole stick to the knitting, your voice is not valid in these broader conversations. That's what that's all about, is just silencing voices that politicians don't want to hear, and voices that are making the world seem more complex, right? Because it is. So at a very high level, they're things that have always interested me and engaged me. And the final thing I'd say is that all of this is only ever about making people's lives better, right? Like, that's what it's got to be about. Like, a strong economy for the sake of a strong economy just doesn't, why? And so how do we keep trying to shape the work that we're doing and the way we're engaging so that more and more people see themselves in it and see the relevance to them and understand the importance of it? And by definition, I think that means it's not one dimensional.
Thanks, Melinda and Andrew, to start. Very inspiring to hear. Question I've got, and this could both to both of you. Like, I'm at this impact investment conference here in Sydney, and there is also talk about this changing political world and how ESG and words like DEI are no longer sort of being used or talked about as publicly, and it's becoming a little bit like, not fully like the early Christians making their little fish signs and not talking about such things, but a bit of a shift into it. And, this is coming from capitalism, from this purpose line, but still from this return side. And Melinda, you sort of made mention that, one of the challenges we've seen is there has been economic growth, but it's been lumpy, and that's probably where, we have the political paradigm internationally in the States, and here, Europe and elsewhere, that's sort of a reflection of that. Like, if you are someone in business, whether you're on a board or you're in a leadership role, or you're just part of that, like, what advice would you have to how you navigate that sort of words, about that sort of BI and ESG? And I mentioned at the start, like the likes of Meta, I wouldn't say they're fully shifted, but there's been a big sort of pendulum swing back, and a whole bunch of people that are like, great, okay, that moment's over. We can just get back to, making money. And that's really the sole goal, if that's part there. I'm just interested in, like, what advice you've got there's a myriad of people I put forward there: owners, workers, advisory. So how to sort of navigate this world that we're currently in.
Do you want me to start, Andrew? Or so I think there's a couple of things that we need to sort of talk about here, right? And I think I do think that there is an issue here about what people are going to say publicly and what we think about how brave they are or are not going to be publicly, and then what they do and how they communicate it to their stakeholders and employees and investors directly. And the reason I'm saying that is because there's quite a few people who feel like they've kind of been punched in the nose at the moment by a big bully overseas, who actually is influencing a lot of things that are not necessarily immediately evident to people. So, for instance, the reach into university funding in Australia through research grants and things like that is very real. And people are having to think about, how they're positioning themselves. And there's a transition in all of this, right? And so I guess it's just by way of saying, I'm interested in what people are actually doing. I'm probably being a little bit more generous and sort of letting them find their feet in terms of how they effectively communicate this now. But the fundamental message for me has always been that diversity and inclusion is good for business. And that people and organizations who have pursued that through the lens of the benefits to their employees and to their business and their investors will continue to do that, and have probably been the most effective ones at achieving those outcomes and in owning their objectives and what they've been achieving, right? And so I don't see any sense at all from anyone that they're backing away from that. And I thought it was really interesting in the immediate aftermath of some of this from the US that there were some people who are very pro DE&I who actually welcomed the challenge, if you like, to what was a little bit of washing of all of these things. That people who felt they had to do it and it wasn't genuine, and so in some senses kind of calling that out. And I think that's, I think that's valid. I think, there were examples of organizations that were running at this stuff and they weren't doing it genuinely, and it was all just a bit of window dressing. So if we get down to the truth of this a bit more, and the people who really believe it own it, I think what you're going to see over time is that they are going to be the beneficiaries of a really strong employee value proposition, of really strong employee loyalty, of productivity, of innovation, and all of the things that we know that diversity and inclusion brings. And the thing I think we have to focus on is actually that I always focus on inclusion first, because if you create an inclusive workplace, then you tend to get the other things a lot more readily and easily. And I think it has to include all voices, and that's probably what we have to learn from the last little while.
Thanks, Melinda. Andrew, you're over in New Zealand at the moment as part of B Corp Lunch, and serendipitously this event sort of ties into it too, which is good. Like, what are you seeing on the hustings of that? How many businesses are there that sort of are part of the B Corp community across the two countries?
Yeah, we're just approaching 800 businesses across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, and give or take 80-20% sort of sits about right at any moment in time. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's lots of businesses who are yet to feel that kind of direct impact that you're speaking to there, Melinda, in terms of there's a lot of noise, but there's relatively few people feeling that direct impact. There's certainly a lot of curiosity, but there's also, I think, as Melinda, you put it so well, amongst those that not only do this, but believe in this, there's a leaning in, there's a, yep, we're still doing this, and an acute awareness that the immediate victims of this dialogue are those who feel like they're from minority groups of any particular measure. So there's sort of lead with empathy for the people directly impacted. But then I think there's also something in what we haven't done well in the last little while is normalize disagreement or normalize dilemmas. And business leaders need to get comfortable not having answers too. I saw Accenture come out and respond in the US where they basically said we had a choice of either sacking high-pay workforce or abandoning ship on DEI because they directly get a lot of government contracts. And on the face of it, you think, yeah, that's a shocking dilemma. That's two bad outcomes. So they sort of justify the move by saying we've chosen what we think is the least worst outcome, which is we're going to abandon DEI in order to keep employing people. And you can get your head around that and go, you know what, that actually feels like maybe that's the right choice. But reality is they're both terrible choices, and they had no room to think about a third way or to even engage with people. They had to make a call quickly. And again, I have empathy for that situation. But I think what business has become pretty bad at is sitting in the discomfort of not knowing which way to go and demanding space to do that, finding space to do that. So I think that we need to give lots of people room to really take time to interpret what is going on. What is my relationship to this issue? What is my contribution to this issue? And demand less position taking for the sake of it. Again, I respect the fact that there are some organizations immediately and directly impacted, and of course they need to deal with it. But I think a lot of other people need to take time to figure it out.
Thanks. Melinda, I at the start, I mentioned this strategy, this 2050 strategy that CEDA sort of put forward that are launching there. Can you give us a bit of background of that and where you're seeking to take it, how it differs from before, and what does that look like for a future Australia, and it ties into what we're speaking to today?
Yeah. And thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity, Simon. Let me just kind of touch on a couple of things. For people who don't necessarily know a lot about CEDA, so we are a member-driven think tank. To be honest, when I was appointed, we were doing a lot of events, but a lot less of the think tank work, and so we've been trying to really amplify that think tank and influence piece of our work, because we felt it was really important to have an independent kind of centralist voice, if you like, putting evidence and fact and ambition on the table in a way that lots of people could engage with. Our membership base is broad. We have membership across all sectors, so government, academia, business, and organisations like Simon's, in that sort of social community space. I have always been a passionate believer that the best of what we can do is achieved at the intersection of those sectors. It's not, the best business in the world driving things. It's everyone working together, because, and particularly at a time of great complexity. So that's kind of the DNA of that, if you like. Progress 2050 is about putting long-term goals for our future out there and persistently prosecuting them. And I was thinking about this as Andrew was asking me. One of the challenges when you find yourself in these environments where it's just crazy whipsaw sort of stuff that happens is how do you tether yourself or anchor yourself in what really matters. And it's not to say that that's going to be a perfect solution to the challenge that Andrew described for Accenture, right? But actually being really clear about what you think is important and why, right? What are the benefits? Why are you pursuing this? We think is really important. And giving yourself the space to bring more people into the conversation and to recognize that there are probably lots of different ways in which you can achieve those objectives and outcomes. That's what we're trying to do. And so Progress 2050 is about articulating a set of goals for the future that we think are critical, that we are going to use to guide our work and our public advocacy. And I'll come back on the public advocacy piece at the end. And so essentially it's about really owning the fact that there are two pillars to future prosperity that we see. One is a strong economy, and one is a strong social compact. And that's about understanding the relationship that people perceive between themselves and the benefits of a strong economy and what that delivers. Now, think about that broadly. That's about the employment opportunities and all of that, but it's also about an economy that is capable of delivering the housing, the education, and the care that they need throughout their lives. And how do we understand who pays for that and how, and have confidence that it's always going to be there? So that social compact piece is really important. People sometimes are surprised that an economist sort of bangs on about this all the time. But if you go back and have a look at the times when we've tackled these kinds of challenges before, which we have, for instance, through the whole Keating changes of government and reform, there was a really strong social compact element to all of those big shifts. And that was how they were achieved. And people forget that. They talk only about the economic reforms, but the very clear transaction with the community and what government was going to do was fundamental to that. So that's sort of the core of it. To just give you a bit of a flavour around, the goals, we've got 6 goals. I won't go through all of them, but for instance, the first one is that we think that Australian businesses should be amongst the most dynamic and competitive in the world. Why? Not just because it delivers for shareholders, but because that's going to create the innovations that's going to help us deal with climate change, because that's going to create the exciting jobs that young people want and deserve for their future. And it's going to create the new goods and services that Australians need, right? So it's a no-brainer, but it also hooks back to individuals. And on the social compact side, I've already sort of referred to this. It's about making sure that every Australian has housing. Like, we're a rich country, we should be able to do that. Our older Australians should know that they're going to get proper aged care and that we'll have enough workers for it. So it's really about being ambitious, and then the path to that, if people don't agree with our goals for progress, please tell us what you think progress looks like. Be a part of the conversation and tell us what you think the best way is. So that's the aim. And we've got a lot of other stuff that's going to fold out beneath it in terms of specific research projects and objectives. But the final point I wanted to make is that, we've been trying to be braver as an organization, and people can say it's just policy and it's not politics. That's just rubbish. Policy is politics now, and you've seen that really clearly. And the challenge is, and I've kind of alluded to this before, at the moment, the public narrative, particularly from the voices that are sort of trying to control it, in Australia, at least in my view, they're trying to narrow people whose voices are seen as valid and relevant and legitimate. That's part of the stick to your knitting. This is not for you. That's that whole campaign around business leaders shouldn't speak up. By the way, the community doesn't agree with that. And it's just, you don't have a voice. You're not this, you're not that. Your voice is irrelevant. And so how do you create a framework as an independent think tank that allows you to be brave, right? And it's just to be really clear and to create a framework that shows people what you're on about and why, and that no surprises, and it actually holds us to account to be persistently prosecuting that. And if we don't, the test for our members is, are you going to hold us to account? Because it's pretty hard to be in the kitchen sometimes. And the challenge is, how do you make yourself say what you have to say when you have to say it?
Thank you, Melinda. Andrew, I'm interested in what you see happening, not just within B corporations here and there, but like, how do you sort of see the pushback that's happening now, or that argument that for less red tape in business is getting louder or doing that much? How are you navigating that, both, in your professional context and your own business experience and your personal one too, for what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, it's such an interesting one. I think when and Melinda as well, I so that idea of what a business's responsibility is in social debates got really sharp in Australia in the Voice campaign, which is possibly worthy of dissecting again. But the the red tape one is a really interesting one because so often when we hear business say we need less red tape, instinctively what I hear is we need to be free to cause more harm. And I think as I've kind of learned more and probably got a bit of experience, I think that's an unfair take. I think that the reality of the business bargain is that the corporate model allows us to start a company, limit our liability and get special taxation treatment in exchange for basically almost the rights of the person. The businesses can own property, it can employ people, can sue and be sued. You know, they're like people in many respects, yet they've got special treatment. And the bargain is not clearly struck, or the impact of that is getting a bit loose. Businesses used to have a purpose. They used to have to define it, and we kind of moved away from that. And now when you start a business and your accountant gives you the golf company and off you go, the system gives you a purpose, which is short-term profit maximization. And you have to go out of your way to not do that. It's a really fascinating bargain. And one aspect of that is that for the last 20 years in particular, we've been trying to regulate businesses in to kind of stop causing harm. And we've lost sight of the fact that there has to be a moral imperative in exchange for that kind of protection, the ability to make money with limited liability. There has to be something more than just, okay, you keep shifting the rules and I'll keep trying to work in and around them. We've really lost sight of that. That bargain was, I think, more deeply held at a moral level as recently as 30, 40 years ago. So when we hear less red tape, I think we do need to try and unpack what do we mean by that. There is a risk that we're starting to want to try and over-regulate businesses to stop some of the harm, that it's becoming incredibly hard in some sectors to run a business. Compliance is a real problem. And we're seeing that in even climate disclosure spaces at the moment, where there is, I think, a legitimate conversation to be had around we're getting organizations to put all of their resources into compliance reporting. I would much rather they put them into performance improvement, to reducing their emissions, not talking about their emissions. And of course, there's a system at play here and that will follow the reporting. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating conversation that we need to empower more people to be comfortable talking about the idea of what are the core responsibilities of a business? How do we create a bargain that doesn't just rely on the kind of freewheeling, do what you want, and we'll try and regulate our way to a sane outcome. That's not working for us. But I think there aren't too many governments at the moment interested in having that conversation, that kind of, fairly core level rethink of the corporate bargain. And our job is to, at the moment, the B Corp community is a great example of a pretty large footprint of businesses who are willing to be far more accountable, starting off with a moral imperative. We accept that we're interdependent, we have an impact, and we want to try and articulate that to a positive one. That's a moral imperative that B Corps take on. And I think it's proving that it is possible.
Can I just quickly jump in there? Like, I just think those points are so well made. And the way I would sum it up is that I think we need to lift our expectations of business, right? And actually, that there is a higher expectation that they do it without this sort of, the sense that they're being demanded to do it. You know what I mean? And I think where we've got ourselves at the moment is that we are over-regulating. It's actually not effective. And you get yourself in this really vicious cycle where things become more and more prescriptive. Government's never going to have all the information from business. Like, they're just never going to, right? And so if you just, if you set the expectation that you're always going to do the wrong thing, and that's sort of where you run to, regulation is forever trying to play catch up, and you create this false expectation in the community that you can actually do it. And then something happens again. And then the community's like, well, you have to go harder. It's just not the answer. I think Andrew's exactly right. We have to change the responsibility. And I just think, people talk to me about the role of business and community as if, this, don't be involved. Business has been involved in the community for hundreds of years. Like the bank managers who were in the communities, in regional towns 70 years ago, they were doing stuff other than just writing loans. And at the moment now, it's just like, oh no, you just have to come to work, do your work, and go home, and you're like this sort of ivory tower that has no sort of relationship. So I I think it's really time to sort of rethink that and our whole attitude towards it, and actually tell business we think they've got a really important role to play and we've got high expectations for it.
Thank you. Because Melinda, you sit on the board of Australian Unis. That's I know not a business per se, but it's Australia's oldest social enterprise. Is that correct? Or it's a yeah.
It is a business and it is a for-profit business, but the profits we reinvest for the benefit of members. And one of the things it does allow us to do is take a really long-term approach to some things. So we can invest in, long-term ideas like how do you deliver mental health services for people with
Yeah.
acute depression and anxiety better than the system. And so it allows us to go overseas and have a look at what people are doing, bring things back, test them, put them into an Australian context, and then deliver better outcomes. But definitely we are a serious business in terms of having to have commercial outcomes, because otherwise it's just unsustainable, right?
Yeah. I'm interested in both of the points that you've said about that role of business, especially in Australian context. And I think maybe culturally the way like how we look on business with a bit more of a dim view than would say in the US. But then on the other hand, people look at Elon Musk and go, we don't necessarily want that as part of it too. Like if someone's here from like, what advice do you have for Australian companies that are in this space about steps that they could be doing to sort of work towards that social compact or some of those things? People who are going, we get it. Like everyone in this room is optimistic for I want to do this. What are some sort of potential tangible ways, both within your orgs or broader, that we can be doing a better job here?
So first of all, I'm going to go back to the comment I made before. It is tough to be a public voice now, and there is a lot of pressure to not be putting your head up. And that's one of the reasons why I'm hoping that, we can take on a braver, bolder role and kind of push some of that space to create more space for others to have a perspective as well, right? But it is quite challenging, I think, for a lot of businesses in Australia. I think, my advice is you have to do what you think is right and good for your business, work with your stakeholders and understand that, and then try to continually communicate as best you can, and to try to find ways not to shy away from the things that are good for your business, right? And good for your employees and good for your ability to attract and retain really great workers, right? Like, and sustainable long-term investments, all the investors and all those kinds of things. So I think, it's an overused word, but this concept of social license and really trying to understand the expectations of others is an important theme of the work that we do at CEDA as well. We run a public policy dynamics course, which is designed to bring essentially business and government together to try to understand each other's perspectives a little bit more, because I think there is a need to actually really shift that relationship. I think too often the public sector has a very dim view of all businesses being rent seekers, and they want to bring them in to be part of the solution. But man, oh man, it's a tough lens to sort of deal with. On the flip side, I think too many people in business don't necessarily really reflect on what the public interest sort of objectives of politicians and government is, right? And that's that social compact piece. And it is very different in the US. We have a different social compact, right? And so I think really trying to understand that, really trying to understand each other's expectations, and then have an honest conversation about it. I know that sounds probably a bit naive, but the final thing I'll say as an example is, we've got an AI community of best practice, and everyone's talking about ethical AI and responsible AI. And I talk about trust, because if I talk about ethics, I can define my ethical framework, right? If I talk about responsibility, I can define what I think is responsible. But if I want you, Simon, to trust me, or you, Andrew, to trust me, I have to understand what it takes to earn your trust, which forces me to understand your expectations. And I think that's the issue of trust, and we've got to build better trusted relationships.
Thank you, Melinda. And Andrew, to that sort of advice, please. I recall that whenever I catch up with you, it's like, why aren't you doing more? What is it? Is the B Corp just the community for people to feel good? Like, why don't you get more people together, like coming around action items? I'll always sort of put that forward as one of the parts too. And I can definitely see like there's like a very strong narrative from an employee perspective about sort of the role of B Corps play. But I'm interested in hearing from you, similar to how Melinda's framed it from her vision with CEDA, about what you see the B-Lab community in Australia and New Zealand could be doing, or some of the other parts in terms of as we're trying to re-envisage what Australian business looks like in the future.
Yeah, I think I'm forever disappointing you, Simon, which is not a bad place to be. But the reality is that we did some analysis a while back, sort of doing some strategic planning 5-6 years ago, thinking about pretty basic question, which is how many B Corps do we need to sort of, start to drive wider change? And the most useful tool was that kind of typical tipping point stuff around product innovation, which is, somewhere around 25% of the sort of people start doing something it tips. And if you extrapolate that to companies, it's an enormous number. We have 800 businesses, a drop in the ocean of the number of businesses in this part of the world. But what we've come to see in the last couple of years is outsized influence, and less in terms of overt power. We're not a think tank. We look to other people to come up with those answers. The influence is more in an organic sort of way, that people are looking to B Corps for answers to deal with problems that they're trying to solve. So it's primary strength in the B Corp community is the willingness to share answers to problems, and getting that out is a really kind of lo-fi thing. It's not super exciting, but I think it's incredibly powerful. Interestingly, it starts to fall foul of competition laws at times, which are constructed to stop companies from collaborating. And the ACCC has come up with a spectacular mechanism that says you can come and ask our permission if you want to cooperate on a sustainability issue, and we'll have a think about it, which just feels like an incredibly slow response to something that needs fast solutions. But anyway, the idea is first that there is great influence and power in driving change within businesses, and the ripple effect is real. But secondly, we are starting to think about what is the data and evidence and the stories that we have in the B Corp community that can support policy developers and lawmakers. And that's an area that we're increasing our influence in, and we've started to make more submissions to governments. And interestingly, in New Zealand, there's been some opportunities open up with this new government over here, which is a conservative leaning government in a 3-way coalition. That's a little bit hectic. But they have brought some conversations, and I think it's not a too partisan thing to say that in Australia, a Labor government hasn't brought as much reform as many people might have liked. So us using the data and evidence that we have, we've got a significant footprint of businesses proving that you can do business in a very different way, still make money. It's a for-profit community. That I think there's a lot of power in that, and we're just starting to really uncover what we can do with it.
Thanks, Andrew. I've got we asked some questions at the outset. What I might do, I might just share my screen briefly to see what some of the results are in, but also post that, I'd really like to open up the questions to both of Andrew and Melinda and myself from the floor too. So I'll just go here and load what we're saying. All right, sorry, it's not going full screen, but I'll just see, rank how you're organized. Purpose is very high. I think it would make sense with the interest here. Mind you, we had a lot more interest in this webinar than I had thought. Probably, I think I was aiming for about 100 people sign up. We had about 160. So I think we're sort of hitting on a bit of a nerve here. It's good to see that it's fair, and I'm glad that purpose as an irreverent buzzword is like, and that a lot of the all people orgs that working with have a purpose statement. This is also, what are we reading here? Diversity inclusion is still very high. Donating time to charities is there. Taking strong stance on the political topics and pro bono work. So look, we'll share this later. I don't know if this ties into any other data points, both might assist within CEDA or B Labs or even beyond people on that call. But I just think it's an interesting reflection that what people are talking to there. So to that end, yes, sorry, Tom, nice to see you, Tom. They've been there too. So look, we now have that opportunity to sort of put questions there. I think through the format that we've got, Rachel, there are more questions that will come up through chat. They'll be able to come through. While we're waiting for those, okay, that's fine. So we're still, there's an open slate at the moment for people that are wanting to come into that too. I guess while we're waiting for that, I'm interested from Melinda, you made mention for like a very strong core cornerstone of what CEDA is to do from an economics basis is around productivity. And, we're now in a world where, there's been some productivity gains through the internet revolution over the years. We're about to be on the cusp of AI. We also hear a lot of, we're not being productive enough, or even from a partisan, like, a lot of, NGOs and government services going, hey, if we just doubled our funding, we'd be able to do this. And we're in a fiscal time where that isn't tenable. I'm interested in, like, what's your take on how we're going with productivity? How does businesses that have values shift that needle, either for or against it? And your advice on what we could be doing as we become back to the strategy that CEDA has of a more prosperous Australia.
Yeah.
Reflection on that.
I mean, let me just make the kind of put this into context a little bit. And so, first of all, productivity performance has been terrible, and we should be really, really concerned about it, because it is actually what drives our ability to afford higher living standards for all Australians, right? One of the big conundrums, I sort of referenced it before, was that we sort of had this narrative about, oh man, we're the economic envy of the world, and we've sustained these record run of years of strong economic growth. And when you look back, you can see that increasingly that was underpinned by, one, investment in the mining sector, and commodities prices, which really boosted that sector and kind of made the aggregate look and feel a little bit better. And two, really strong population growth, largely driven through immigration. And productivity performance per se was really anemic. Now, productivity performance per se is what drives real wages. So then you track to real wages, and there's this whole sense that real wages haven't kept up with productivity, but the problem is they have, because productivity has been woeful. So outside of a very small number of sectors, and that's what people have felt, right? But meanwhile, you've had all these other narratives about how great the economy is. So now broadly people equate productivity with really negative things: having to work harder, having to work longer, largely unpaid work, people losing their jobs because of technological or other transformational shifts happening in the economy, and they don't really like it. And they also liken economic growth to basically congestion and more people and challenges around housing affordability. So they don't really see this as a good thing, but actually it is. And so we have to figure out how we drive productivity. It has to be through stronger investment. Business investment has been terrible. It kind of harks back to this conversation about regulation in the investment environment. And we have to really drive innovation and think about innovation in a positive sense and how it enables job creation and opportunity. We struggle with that. We tend to look at, these are the jobs that we can clearly define that are going to be done away with, but we have no imagination when we think about all of the really amazing jobs that it could create and the higher incomes and everything else. So, nested within that is we have to rethink regulation. We have to rethink how business and government work together. This is what the Building Australia, Building a Better Future for Australia is, and the Building Australia Fund, blah, blah, blah. We have to seriously think about skills and education. We need to think about those differently to how we are at the moment. I was having a conversation with someone earlier today, unbeknownst to people, school completion rates for boys is dropping, particularly in critical areas. And we're not paying attention to that. And we're not thinking about how we engage kids in a relevant and empowering and interesting education, which is going to set them up for a life of lifelong learning. We can look to the Nordics, they do it well. So this is that there are so many different things we have to be doing differently. The final thing I'd say is this notion of social compact. Our social compact frayed when our tax revenues were pouring in the door from the commodity cycle, and governments kind of just did this and they didn't target spending. And, that was the whole lifters and leaners narrative when we got mean. And now everyone thinks that they should get a piece of everything. And we have to go back to, if you can afford to pay for things, you should pay for them. We need a proper social safety net, and we need to really innovate in how we provide care. So, sorry, that's just like a blah, but.
I did ask. No, thank you, Melinda. What are your perspectives there, Andrew? Like, what are the, we're starting to get to the time that's there, even like reflecting on what Melinda was talking about, or even just projecting ahead. Like, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is shifts in the world that have happened in mere months. Like if I was to ask, what's something that you'd like to see happen by the end of this fiscal year? I mean, sorry, not fiscal year, that's very shortly, pardon me, the calendar year, in the next 6 months. What are some things that businesses could be doing, government or other players, if we're wanting to sort of drive towards a way to create a more optimistic future for Australia and the role that business can play? What are your reflections?
I guess that rules out staging a revolution.
Well, we
But
could. I mean, Andrew, we can look at that, but I mean, it's under the revolution, are businesses on the other side, or have they been sort of part of that old world guard?
yeah, who wins? Look, there was there's a great organization in the US called the Long Now, which is basically an institution that tries to get us to do long-term thinking, which is something that we don't do a particularly good job of, both at public policy level, but also inside business. And I think, to be fair, at the moment, it's really hard to think long-term inside business in such a shifting sand environment. But there was a podcast I listened to from them on just on Friday, a conversation between Kate Raworth, who's the author of the Donut Economics Model, and Roman Krasnarek, who's a sort of social philosopher, who wrote a book called The Good Ancestor. And what was really interesting in the conversation was that when we think about what drives change, and it's easy for organizations like mine to think we're driving change, but of course systems change happens when a whole bunch of different things happen around you. No one person or organization can be responsible for it. And Roman was talking about those moments in time. What are the kind of three things he phrases it as? Often you need a crisis. Crises drive change. And we saw COVID have a huge impact on lots of different things and drive a lot of change. You also need movements. You need collective movements of people. And at the moment, we are so fragmented. This is that whole idea that we can't agree on anything anymore. So movements are really hard to hold. They slip and they move. And crucially, there's another ingredient they talk about, which is you need proven models to demonstrate how things can be different. And I think that's, for me, what's most inspiring the B Corp movement is you've got a group of people in business demonstrating you can do things differently. The scary part is that crises aren't usually very nice things to live through. And I do struggle sometimes, Simon, with this idea of what do we need to drive change at speed and scale. History tells us that so often it is a crisis. And that's a bit scary. And the people that will lose most in the climate crisis are the most disadvantaged in the world. So crises are really just events. They're usually very unjust events. I don't know what the next one will look like. Most of the science says that they're all going to be climate related. But what I think we can do in the meantime is invest in the new models, invest in new ways of thinking, and invest in demonstrative models, new ways to do business, because they have to be in place when the enthusiasm for change, whether it comes from a revolution or maybe an enlightened government, they're going to need to rest on models that are proven to work. What's exciting is that we have so many of those models in place. Not sure I've answered your question there. To be a little more specific, people in business, I really resonate with what you said earlier, Melinda, which is speak up. I think what happened in The Voice, or one element of what happened, is that business leaders were more comfortable in the marriage referendum because there was more social sort of cohesion behind the outcome. They were less comfortable in The Voice because it was more, it didn't have political consensus and it was deeply divided. But that's a call for leadership. You can't follow, you need to lead. And I think business leaders need to get more comfortable speaking out beyond the four walls of their business. I think that's an important ingredient. It's not going to do anything on its own, but it's one element I would call for.
Thanks, Andrew. Sorry,
can I just jump in behind that? I just think, I think one of the mistakes possibly that people sort of made or have made in thinking about different sort of causes and referendums and progress, marriage equality was a tremendous outcome, but it was also the fastest social movement in history in terms of going from one thing to the next. And one of the things that people have shared with me is the fact that aside from people who had very, very conservative religious perspectives, broadly, no one felt that it had any impact on them. And part of the challenge, and this kind of goes back to my social compact point and the whole Keating stuff, was that we've pretended like no one has to lose anywhere. And that was the point about when we had money pouring in the door, the loss of the social compact was because we didn't have to make any choices. So we never did. And life is all about choices. And our politicians seem to have forgotten that that's what we have to do. And we've lost the ability, it seems, to be able to have sensible, constructive, respectful, robust conversations about that. And we've just ignored a whole bunch of other things and pretending like they weren't happening. So I just think this is a moment where we've got to be really open and honest and a lot more forthright about these issues, but also don't forget that the middle ground, like so much of the debate and narrative at the moment is just being controlled by the smaller proportions of people in more extreme positions. And I say that because I guess my final word, Simon, is I think we really need to protect that middle ground, and protect what's important to that middle ground and not let it be captured. And broadly speaking, particularly in Australia, I do think it's that there is a really strong, sensible middle ground who they care about other people, they care about the future. When their life is under threat financially, whatever, it's harder for them, but it still exists and we should have faith in it.
Thank you, Melinda. We're nearly at time for closing. We've got a couple of questions which have been good. I want to frame one that we've got from Beck Gluten from First Nation Affairs into probably a bit of a closing statement for you both. They mentioned, do you think we've got into that rut of providing in-cutter measures to what have become complex impact and influences? I think it's probably like a part of it that I think I would be in agreement of yes. And I just wanted to get back to this when we started about this word of optimism. Like what takeaway could you have for Beck and others about how we shift from providing, whether it be in business or policy of the direction we're doing of things that have same fit for everyone to how we navigate more complex impact and influences in that political climate. And even if we're thinking about an optimistic takeaway, it doesn't have to be optimistic, but we all said we're optimists of what I think about how people like Beck and others navigate this in the future. Andrew, I'll start with you.
So it's a great question. I would offer maybe a comment on coming back to ethics. I did a great program last year, and the course leader, Matt Beard, who's a prominent ethicist in Australia, he framed something really simple, but I thought was beautiful. We need to get better at creating ethical spaces, which is places where you can have conversations where we're thinking about who's in the room, what's the dynamic, is this a diverse space, are we getting different perspectives? So ethical spaces requires you to really frame a place. But then the second thing we need to do is find space for ethics. So we actually need to start talking amongst ourselves in our organizations about difficult and challenging things before we have to make a choice amongst them. And so often, I think in our life and in business particularly, suddenly something comes along. We don't have a muscle for it. We don't know how to resolve the unresolvable. We don't know how to choose between two bad outcomes. So when we're confronted with that, we're not good at it. So space for ethics is all about deliberately and intentionally going and setting up conversations, particularly in workplaces, but in other social spaces as well, that embrace the idea of, hey, there's no easy outcome here. How might we resolve this if we had to? We just leave it until we have to pick a winner. And we see that play out in so many ways where the conversation gets reduced to who's the biggest winner or who's the biggest loser out of this and who we're going to back.
Thanks, Andrew. What about, and as a final comment, reflecting on that, Melinda?
So just a couple of quick things. I mean, firstly, I totally agree. I think one of the things we have to do is create the space to sit in problems more. The whole environment now is rushed to the solution, and sometimes there isn't an obvious and immediate solution. I think we need to spend a lot more time understanding people's perspectives. And I think we need to spend a lot more time doing two things. One is actually looking at whether things like being clear about what is the outcome we're looking for from changes that we're talking about and actually seeing whether they're delivered. So a lot of policy at the moment is actually just crap policy, spending a lot of money. And the second thing I think we need to do is actually really call out when a policy or decision is being driven by a particular value set, which is not backed by evidence. And the example I would give there is this values-driven approach to job seeker payments, which implicitly is that if you make people desperate enough by not allowing them to live their life in dignity, that they will be more incentivized to work, which is just a complete crock. But somehow we've allowed everyone to sort of get away with that. It's not driven by evidence. It's not driven by any sort of policy perspective. It's driven by a value, an ideological perspective, which is delivering really bad outcomes.
Thanks, Melinda. And thank you to Andrew for both being involved today and for everyone who's attended, both in person and in the recording. I've certainly enjoyed that discussion and the ability to start this. I hope it's the first of a number of them. And as we continue to evolve, and thanks everyone for the time, and enjoy the rest of the day. Cheers, everyone.